and simply accepting the fact at face value without flinching. But I'd like to spend most of this lecture on Camus' last novel. It started out as a short story, but as so often, these things grow. And it is perhaps the most striking of all of Camus' novels, although I'll add that in my experience teaching it to undergraduates and to adults, I find that it's the adults who really pick up the message much faster than the undergraduates, for good reason. It's a story about success and failure, and most undergraduates are still hoping for success. Most of them haven't known genuine failure yet, and so there is a lesson here which I find older folks, older being older than 21 anyway, tend to appreciate much more. The novel is called The Fall, and that title, of course, has religious significance, and there's a good deal of religious imagery throughout the book, some of which I'll discuss briefly as we go. But the novel itself is about one person, and that it's like the stranger. And in fact, the contrast between the fall and the stranger is so profound that I'll be using it throughout my description. To begin with, the character in The Fall, whose name is Jean-Baptiste Clémence, John the Baptist, he is a character of infinite sophistication. He is, unlike Meursault, very articulate, thoughtful. In fact, you might say that where Meursault, at least through the first half of The Stranger, is virtually thoughtless, certainly doesn't think about things, Clémence, throughout The Fall, is completely reflective. He sits in a bar drinking a delicious Dutch gin, and as far as we can tell, he hardly even tastes it. He lives in Amsterdam, which has not the best weather in the world, but apart from occasionally complaining about the dreariness and the shivers, one gets the sense that he doesn't really care. In short, if Meursault is a paradigm of the unreflective life, Clémence is a paradigm of the reflective life, pure reflection. And then the obvious question comes up, is he therefore happy? And the answer is quite easy, no. Now, what's interesting with Clémence is, to begin with, he illustrates that thesis that comes from Camus and other works, but also from Dostoevsky, that might be summarized as consciousness is a problem. In fact, it's put a little bit more bluntly. Consciousness is a disease. It is in contrast with that happy innocence which Meursault pursues through the first part of his novel, The Stranger. It is in contrast with that sense of freedom, that sense of spontaneity that Meursault enjoys in the first part of The Stranger, which of course eventually gets him in so much trouble. Clémence does nothing spontaneously. In fact, you get the sense as he's talking that everything he does is calculated. Everything has an ulterior motive. Now, The Stranger, as I pointed out, was written in the first-person point of view, and to good effect, because a movie of The Stranger, and by the way, they did make one, Visconti made a movie with Marcel Mastroianni, didn't do a bad job given the challenges of the task, but the truth is that a film of a perfectly ordinary man who goes through life in a perfectly ordinary way, in itself, even with that wonderful Mastroianni click of the tongue, doesn't make a very fascinating film. What makes the novel so fascinating is the fact that from the first person, we see through Meursault's consciousness, and we see the vacuity, the emptiness there. With Clémence, on the other hand, we get a very different picture and a very different style. This isn't a category in literature as far as I know, but you might say it's a novel written in the second person. What we get is Clémence's confessions, and that's certainly what they are, confessions to a fellow who is seated next to him at a bar. But of course, the character to whom he's speaking gets even less to say than, for example, one of Plato's interlocutors for Socratic dialogues. In other words, he doesn't even get a yes, sir, I agree, Socrates, but rather it's more, at best, an implied kind of yes or no. In short, the message you get in The Fall is that Clemence is talking to you, the reader. And in that sense, I want to say it's a second-person novel precisely in the sense that it is a novel that is addressed to you as reader without being obviously addressed to you at all. Now, who is Clemence? Well, I mentioned that he is extremely sophisticated. In fact, he is a man who is almost perfect. The novel, like The Stranger, is divided into two parts. Except unlike The Stranger, it's not quite so wooden as Part 1, Part 2. Rather, it's a novel which is presented to us by way of what in film language we'd call flashbacks. There are, in effect, two Clemences. There is what I'll call the old Clemence and the new one. The old Clemence was a lawyer in Paris. He was extremely successful. He was a defense attorney, and he took on, as he puts it, widows and orphans, charity cases. He felt very good about what he did. He felt he was making a genuine contribution to society. He felt he was really helping people, even though some of them didn't deserve that much help. He was fabulously wealthy, although we're not told exactly how he got his money. One presumes it wasn't from being a public defender. But in any case, he makes a lot of telling us that he lives in a penthouse. His language is brilliant. He apologizes at one point early on in the novel for his use of a rare form of the French subjunctive. And he says, "I have a weakness for fine speech." Indeed, he has a weakness for fine, elegant, sophisticated things in general. He says that he cannot think of himself as anything but superior. And in fact, up-down metaphors play an enormous role in this novel. He lives in a penthouse. He looks down at people. And of course, in his job as lawyer, he figuratively gets to look down at lots of people, namely all those people who are guilty or accused, while he himself, the lawyer's advantage, is, on the one hand, absolutely part of the system, but nevertheless free from it. He is never in the role of his clients. He is charming, witty, kind of dashing. One could raise some objections to the way he treats women in the novel, but I would say offhand in 1950s France, what he describes was pretty much par for course or a little bit better. But anyway, he makes it very clear that he has a way with the ladies. In short, it's important to see that Clemence as presented to us, Clemence as he presents himself to us, is just about a perfect character. He is utterly enviable. He is the sort of person we would all like to be. Now that's important precisely for some good traditional reasons. What's going to happen to him, as the title tells us, is he's going to fall. And the fall is represented geographically by his move from Paris to Amsterdam. Paris, the city of lights, to Amsterdam, which, among its many other distinguishing features, is below sea level. And in fact, if you look at a map of Amsterdam, one of the most striking things about it is the fact that it is defined by a series of more or less concentric canals, which essentially ring around each other with what is now Central Station as their key point in common. If you look at that map, one image that suddenly comes to mind is Dante's depiction of hell in the Inferno. And clearly, Clemence has in mind that this, for what Camus has in mind, is that this, for Clemence, is hell. Paris is a kind of heaven. Amsterdam is a kind of hell. The fall itself is something which is not adequately explained, and I'll give you some of the details in a moment. But the important question, of course, throughout the novel, the one that Clemence is always teasing us with, but never answers for us, is why? Now I say that Clemence must be seen as something like an enviable, nearly perfect character for a very important reason. And that reason goes back to a very ancient dispute in philosophy and literature about the nature of tragedy. There is a classic theory, which was presented perhaps most vividly by Aristotle but it's been worked on by many people since, which says, in effect, that what the basis of tragedy must be is a very high-placed character who nevertheless has a tragic flaw. Now, it can't be an evil character, because evil characters, when they get their comeuppance, that's not tragedy. Nor can it be a perfectly good character, because when a perfectly good character gets ruined, destroyed, killed, that's not tragedy except in the sort of trivialized modern sense. That's simply very bad theater. On the other hand, if there is a good man who has a tragic flaw, then at one and the same time, we can feel pity for him. At the same time, we feel admiration, but more importantly, we can understand the fall, the tragedy, in terms of the flaw. Now that becomes critical because when you think about the many injustices and misfortunes in life, there's a sense in which we are all desperate to grab onto the reason why it happened to him or to her and not to me. So a friend dies of cancer, but he or she was a heavy smoker. It's a way of distancing ourselves. There is this that's true of them, it's not true of me, therefore it's not completely unjust. They, in some sense, deserved it. Now this, of course, can be a very cruel theory. As Susan Sontag wrote in a book she wrote some 10 years ago or so, Illness as Metaphor, she chastises those who would say, for example, that people who get cancer in some way deserved it or asked for it or contributed to it. In a way, she's being very Camusian. She's arguing the thesis that these things really are unfair, unjust, and it doesn't make any sense to blame the victim. But that, of course, is our tendency. And so when people suffer severe setbacks, when they're failures, we're very quick to say, they must have done something wrong. And you read literature, whether it's about business and business success, whether it's about health and sort of psychological well-being, whether it's about students in learning, whether it's about people in motor accidents, there is always this question. Well, what did they do that might have contributed to precisely this tragedy? Now, if you can ask that question of Clemence, then there's a sense in which the notion of the fall is undermined. Because, of course, like the biblical story of the fall, it is not just this particular person or these particular people who are falling, but the fall affects all of us. The doctrine of original sin, however you take that, metaphorically, literally, whatever, the doctrine of original sin says we're all essentially flawed in the same way that Adam and Eve were. And the message of Camus' novel is that we are all flawed in the sense that Clemence was. In other words, it's not a flaw at all, it's simply being human. Now, when he was in Paris, as I say, he was a very high-powered attorney. He could talk his way into or out of anything, and in particular, he could get his clients off with a great deal of facility and ease. What he's doing with us in the bar, on the other hand, is harder to pin down, because the language, the conversation, seems extremely meandering. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere. A lot of it seems like idle chit-chat, little anecdotes, sometimes funny, sometimes morbid, but throughout the book, what we get a sense of is that we're being seduced. And indeed, that's exactly what's happening. Clemence is trying to get us to do something, but he's doing it by talking mainly about himself. And the question is, what's he trying to get us to do? And how's he doing it? Now, I say this book might be seen as being in two parts. Namely, there's the old Clemence in Paris, and there's the new Clemence after the fall in Amsterdam. But, of course, we see the old Clemence, the Clemence in Paris, only through the words of the Clemence that's talking to us here in Amsterdam. And that, of course, carries with it a kind of problem. In the first-person narration of The Stranger, there's little question of deviousness. What we are told is precisely what this character is experiencing at that moment. And while there's always the possibility that we might be misled by a narrative, and some postmodern novels, of course, take great delight in having the narrator tell us that he's really been lying to us for the last 50 pages. But nevertheless, in a novel like that, we simply assume that what we're getting is the experience as it's happening, as free from interpretation as a narrative will allow. With Camus, on the other hand, what we get is a retrospective telling of a story that's already completed. And not just a telling of the facts of the story, in fact, there are very few facts that we're told, but rather they're all interpretations, and particularly very morally loaded interpretations. And so there's a sense in which the story that we're being told about Clemence's old life in Paris is not literally to be believed, but it's like reading an old copy of a newspaper when you have nothing to check it against. What you have to do is figure out somehow there are inaccuracies here, but there's no way you can check them out. Well, the story itself. Camus tells us that he was this very successful attorney, but he also tells us that he was through and through a hypocrite. That in fact what he did in this successful life was really just so much baloney. Here's an example. He says, once he was helping a blind man across the street. And when he finished doing so, he, in the custom of the times, doffed his hat. In other words, a sign of courtesy, a visible sign of courtesy to the blind man. He says, what sense would that make? Obviously, the man couldn't see me do it, so I must have been doing something else. I wasn't, in fact, acting courteously. What I was doing was showing off. My performance was for the sake of all of the other people who may have been watching at the time. Hypocrisy. I didn't mean it as a courtesy. I meant it as an open display of what a good person I am. And so in general, he tells us that his defense of his clients, that his charming behavior, it was all essentially selfish. It was for the sake of his gigantic ego. It was for the sake of his reputation. And it wasn't seriously motivated by the virtues at all. Now, you recognize here a very old set of philosophical disputes. And let me put it in a couple of different ways. First, there's a sophomoric argument which we've all had with each other, possibly in college bull sessions. But it goes on the track, are all human actions ultimately selfish? Do we do everything in a self-interested way? And, of course, the cynical answer is yes. And sometimes there's a kind of sophistical argument that goes behind this, namely, whenever you do anything, you're satisfying one or another of your desires, even if it's the desire to help another person, and insofar as you are satisfying one of your desires, it's a selfish action. Well, of course, that's a bogus argument. Satisfying a desire in itself doesn't make something selfish. But nevertheless, there are some more sophisticated arguments behind that. For example, when you take this instance of, being courteous to the blind man, when you were courteous, did you get a sense of satisfaction out of that? A sense of pleasure, perhaps? Perhaps even a sense that, yes, indeed, I am a good fellow. Well then, couldn't the ulterior motive of your behavior have been not the virtuous action itself, but rather to obtain that sense of satisfaction, of being a good person? And at this point, you might want to say, well, no, I didn't think of it at the time. I think I was just thinking, here's a person that has to be helped. But a whole string of philosophers, going back even to people like Kant, would say, well, the fact is that we never know all the motives behind any of our actions. When we talk about acting morally, the best we can do is insist that there is some consideration of the moral law or the virtue that's at stake, but you can't simply say, that's all that motivated me in this instance. There's always this kind of dark undercurrent of motives which may converge and conflict in all sorts of ways which we don't know about. The notion of the unconscious, which Freud supposedly discovered, as he himself acknowledges, was very much a part of the German philosophical and poetic tradition for generations before him. And so one can use that insight to play this philosophical game. Namely, whatever your conscious memories or your conscious awareness of your motives at the time of an action, that doesn't mean that it's not in fact motivated by something which is straightforwardly selfish, by some expected pleasure, by some expected gain, by some possibility of reward. Now, if that's so, as I think you can all appreciate, it is very easy to look back at any of your past virtuous actions and raise an embarrassing question. Were they in fact virtuous, or did I have an ulterior motive? Granted that I knew that, for example, if I gave my father a birthday present, he would probably feel pleased, and perhaps possibly as a consequence, maybe he would anyway, put me in his will in some satisfactory way. How do I know that that wasn't part of my motivation when I apparently spontaneously gave him a birthday present or whatever? What are the motives of our actions? Now, when you think of it that way, it turns out that if you are self-critical and diabolical enough, you could describe your entire past in terms of one hypocritical action after another, always looking for potentially devious motives when it seemed at the time that you were simply acting spontaneously, generously, virtuously. Take the doffing your hat to the blind man example. My sense of Clemence at that point would be he had become such a creature of habit where courtesy was concerned that unthinkingly he simply completed the action and then doffed his hat as a sign of respect. It wasn't that there was an ulterior motive. It wasn't anything about hypocrisy. He wasn't playing to the crowd, although, of course, Clemence, being Clemence, was always aware of the crowd. It was a perfectly straightforward, honest action as much as anything is. We all do it all the time. I still find myself automatically going to hold a door for someone, going to pick something up for someone. And it's not that I think, gee, I might get a reward for this, but it's rather, this is the way I've been taught to behave, and so I do. But the description that Clemence gives us of his own past behavior, in this sense, is very disingenuous, because the picture he paints of his life in Paris is of that of a total hypocrite, filled with ulterior motives, filled with just that sense of deviousness, which he criticizes quite vocally as he talks to us in Amsterdam. Now, what was the fall? One might think, well, did he get caught taking a bribe, or did he give in to some sort of temptation? And again, Clemence tells us very clearly that no, he's never taken a bribe, and in fact he was, in general, great control of himself, again, accepting certain questions with women, which I'll just sort of pass over for now. But the idea is that what it comes down to is that nothing caused his fall. Or more particularly, there were three events which he gives us in the course of his wandering narration, all of which are trivial. The first was he was in what I think we would all consider a very minor traffic incident. Not the kind where anyone is hurt, but the kind where people are angry. And he got into a fight, in fact, with a young cyclist who, to put it in the vernacular, decked him before he had a chance to respond. Now, one can imagine being in such a situation, and you might be a bit miffed. You might go home and open up a beer, maybe take a nap, watch some television, but it's not the sort of thing that's going to ruin your life. Nevertheless, Clemence describes this event as if it is one of the key ingredients in his downfall. Another incident, he's crossing one of the bridges of Paris at night. It's a dark, rather foggy night, and suddenly he hears a peal of laughter behind him. Now, laughter is a very curious thing. When you hear laughter, I find myself, I immediately get a bit self-conscious. Is someone laughing at me? I walk into a room, and suddenly there's a burst of laughter, and I check myself out rather quickly to see what's going on here. And then I realize, well, these people are really laughing at somebody else's joke. Nobody's looking at me. What's the difference? And you get over it. In this case, Clemence looks, doesn't see anyone, has no reason to suppose that he's the one being laughed at. Nevertheless, this cuts him deeply. And one wonders, how can one interpret such a trivial moment in such a profound way? And clearly, Clemence is giving this event much more significance, as if, what, the cosmos is laughing at him, I suppose, than it is at face value. The third event is more serious only because there is a fatality involved, but even that we're not quite sure. But he's crossing the bridge on another evening, also foggy, also dark, and he hears a scream and a splash, and he realizes that a young woman whom he has seen on the bridge a moment ago has probably leapt to her death. Now, if you think about the bridges of Paris, which are quite high off the water, and if you think about the River Seine, which is, to put it politely, polluted, and if you think about what that would be to make any sort of rescue move from the top of the bridge into the murky waters at night, especially when there's absolute silence, no calls for help or anything like that, one would conclude, I think, that what Clemence could do was nothing. Perhaps he should have made a phone call. Okay. But the truth is that this was the final gesture. This was the final event. And at that point, he throws off his life. He goes to Amsterdam. I'm tempted to say, over nothing. There's nothing he did wrong. There is no cause. And again, back to the classical theories of tragedy. It's important that we realize that there doesn't have to be any specific complaint, any specific crime, any particular offense, that the fall is something to which we are all prone. And the idea is that even if Clemence, this more or less perfect, enviable human being, is prone to see through himself into his inner hypocrisy, then so too it must be the case for all of us. So then he's in Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, he calls himself a judge penitent. It's a curious play, and his life in Amsterdam is filled with questions about judgment. As a lawyer, of course, he was surrounded by judgments, which he didn't make himself and which were not made of him. But nevertheless, the whole nature of the courtroom scenario, the whole nature of the legal profession was essentially concerned with judgments, and judgments in particular about guilt and innocence. Now, when I talked about the stranger, I said that one of the things that happens in the course of the trial, as Meursault is subjected to the judgments of others, is that he comes to lose his sense of innocence, which he had in the first part of the book, and to recognize himself as guilty. But I had, at the time, I said very little about guilt, and of course, guilt is an incredibly complex notion, and to still oversimplify, let me divide it into three different pieces for now. First, not very interesting to us right now, is the notion of legal guilt, where legal guilt is that kind of guilt which is pronounced, declared, made true by a court, by some institution. Now, of course, Meursault is declared guilty by the court, but that's not the kind of guilt he's talking about. And in the same way, we might say that Clemence, by that account, is actually innocent, but legal innocence is of no relevance here. One little footnote here. One of the paintings in the bar where he's hanging out in the central seediest area of Amsterdam is a painting which in fact had been stolen only a few years before Camus wrote the novel. It's a Van Eyck religious altarpiece, and it is called The Just Judges. Clemence comes to accept the painting from the bar, and in that sense, one might say he's guilty of receiving stolen property. That's about the extent of legal guilt which you can accuse him of. On the other hand, there is a sense of guilt, a very broad category we might call moral guilt. It's quite independent of legal guilt, although one hopes they're correlated. It's the sense in which one might be declared innocent by a judge, but nevertheless, everyone knows that he is in fact guilty. He is guilty morally. He in fact did it, and he did it with all the intentions and so on that are necessary for him to be guilty. But third, and most important, there is what you might call the feeling of guilt. But by calling it a feeling, I don't for a moment want to trivialize it and say that it's unimportant. It's the feeling of guilt rather than actually doing something for which you're guilty or declared guilty legally. It's the feeling of guilt that enters most profoundly into, among other things, the Christian religion as sin, and into psychoanalysis as a problem to be cured. And it's the feeling of guilt which the trial in The Stranger is trying to impose upon Meursault. And interestingly enough, he shakes it off with his general philosophy by the end of the novel. But Clémence is steeped in it. And Clémence is an utterly guilty person, feeling utterly guilty, who sees his whole life as a sham, as hypocrisy, as inadequate. Consequently, what he does is he turns on us. Now, there's a sense in which one can see Clémence as a paradigm of precisely that kind of defiance that Camus talked about in Myth of Sisyphus. That defiance, which I said then, is a form of resentment. It's a way of turning your own sense of inadequacy outward, and in some way turning it against those who put you in that position. But with Clémence, of course, it's much more subtle than that. Because what he's doing surely is filled with resentment. But what he's trying to do is to win us over to his way of seeing things. Not his way of seeing himself, of course, that couldn't matter less to him, but rather win us over to his way of seeing ourselves. Now, what would that be? Throughout the book, Clémence has a fixation with superiority. That's why he always had to win his cases. That's why he always had to be the most charming, most intelligent man around. That's why he had to live in a penthouse. And doesn't describe the car in detail in the novel, but one can imagine it's a Ferrari or something very fancy. In general, he always had to be superior. And in that sense, he was very much a show-off, which is not to say a hypocrite at all. At the time he goes to Amsterdam, he moves into not just a city in the lowlands, and obviously there's some chauvinism here about Paris versus Amsterdam, but if you know the city, into what would be the innermost canal or the inner circle of hell on Dante's map. What, if you've been there, you know as the sailors' quarters, the red light district, and he hangs out in what has to be one of the most disreputable bars in the city. In other words, he's making himself as low as he can possibly be. Now, what's the point of that? Well, I said one of the themes of the novel is the theme of judgment. And one of the twists that Clémence gives to an old biblical prescription, he says over and over again, "Judge that ye not be judged." But his twist is that he judges himself before others can judge him. What he found when he was in Paris, living in a penthouse, at the top of his profession, living the high life, was that ultimately he was vulnerable. That the truth was that whenever you are in a position where you can be brought down, you can become vulnerable, aware of the fact that you are precisely ready to be brought down. What the laughter on the bridge signified for him was precisely that vulnerability. What his innocence in the courtroom indicated to him finally was that he too could be one of the guilty. By going to Amsterdam and making himself the lowest of the low, there was a sense in which, to just take the metaphor of the title quite literally, there was no place to fall. And so what he does in his self-description in the bar in Amsterdam is convince us that he now has achieved what he's always really wanted to achieve, a kind of invulnerability. There is no place to fall. But by convincing us that we should now judge ourselves as harshly as he has judged himself, he comes up with precisely the victory that he always sought in court. Namely, he once again comes out to be superior. He is the one who is self-righteous, and we are the ones who are suddenly caught with this awful feeling of failure. Now, Camus was killed not very long after he published this novel. Ironically, he was killed while driving in a fancy sports car with his publisher. His publisher walked away from the accident. In fact, the novel that he was carrying with him at the time has just been published. I also take this as a cautionary note about authors and their relationships with publishers. But word from mutual friends have it that before he died, Camus was about to set out on a trip to India, because what he hoped to learn in India was an awful lot about Buddhism and a certain vision of life, which on the one hand agreed with much of his philosophy in terms of the meaninglessness of it all, and in particular the hypocrisy and the emptiness of what most of us take to be our individual egos. But he never got there, and one can only wonder if he had what trail his philosophy would have taken next.